Beloved, we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against powers unseen, against forces that prowl in the darkness, seeking to lay siege upon the soul. The mind, that sacred chamber where truth is enthroned, is often the first target of the enemy. If Satan can cast a shadow upon the thoughts, if he can plant seeds of doubt, despair, or distraction, then he has already begun his wicked conquest. Do you not perceive it, my brethren? Many walk as though they are free, yet their minds are held captive in invisible chains. The adversary does not need to bind your hands or fetter your feet if he has shackled your thoughts. He is subtle, a master of deceit, whispering lies so gently that they seem as your own musings. He sows fear where faith once flourished. He turns the gaze inward when it ought to be fixed above. He stirs restlessness when peace should reign. And alas, many slumber in the arms of spiritual attack, unaware of their own peril. Yet our Lord is not silent. The shepherd does not leave his sheep defenseless. He has forewarned us, and in his word we find the signs that unmask the enemy's hand. But dear souls, take heed. These warnings are not to be taken lightly. Just as the watchman must cry out when danger approaches, so must we recognize the signs of the adversary's assault upon the mind. The battle is real, the warfare fierce, and the cost of ignorance too great to bear. Are you troubled by an unshakable heaviness, a cloud that refuses to part? Have you found your thoughts ensnared in ceaseless anxieties, though the Lord has promised to keep in perfect peace the one whose mind is stayed on Him? Have you felt a sudden weariness in prayer, a coldness toward the Word, an inexplicable sense of distance from God? These are no light matters. These are signs of an unseen war, an assault upon the very seat of your devotion. Do not mistake these afflictions for mere passing troubles, nor think them common to all men apart from spiritual cause. There are burdens laid by the world, yes, and there are griefs of the flesh, but there is also the dark work of the enemy, seeking to steal, to kill, and to destroy. The prince of this world is not idle, and his arrows are aimed at the citadel of the mind. If he can cause a child of God to doubt, he weakens his walk. If he can cause confusion, he shakes his resolve. If he can fill the heart with guilt and despair, he leads him away from the joy of his salvation. Oh, may the Lord grant us eyes to see. Let us not be blind to the devices of the wicked one, but rather, let us arm ourselves with the truth. For though the attack is fierce, our captain is mighty. Though the darkness gathers, the light of the world has overcome. Be watchful, be sober, be vigilant. Many walk through life unaware that their struggles are not merely of the flesh, nor merely of circumstances, but are signs of an unseen war being waged upon their minds. The enemy does not always strike with open force. More often he moves in shadows, whispering thoughts that seem harmless at first, yet slowly erode the soul's strength. These attacks are subtle, creeping in through emotions, distractions, and doubts until they have taken firm hold. Many dismiss these troubles as common burdens, but those with spiritual discernment will recognize them as the workings of an adversary who seeks to steal, kill, and destroy. One of the most telling signs of a spiritual attack on the mind is an unshakable heaviness. This is not the natural weariness that comes from labor, nor the grief that follows true sorrow, but a weight upon the soul that defies reason. It presses down without cause, draining joy, dulling the senses, and making every spiritual duty seem burdensome. It is a shadow that lingers even in the presence of light, an oppression that does not lift even when circumstances improve. Many assume it to be nothing more than fatigue or passing discouragement, yet it often signals a battle being fought in the unseen realm. This heaviness is designed to weaken faith, to exhaust the spirit until prayer feels futile and worship becomes mechanical. Another sign is the mind's entanglement in ceaseless anxiety. Worry itself is not new to the human condition, but when it overtakes the soul, when it drowns out the voice of faith, when it renders the promises of God distant and ineffective, then it is no longer mere concern, it is an attack. The enemy delights in stirring fear, for he knows that fear cripples faith. A mind consumed with anxieties is a mind that cannot rest in the Lord. These anxieties often arise suddenly, with no clear source, spreading like wildfire until they dominate every thought. They make small troubles seem insurmountable and turn momentary trials into unbearable burdens. The believer who once stood firm now finds himself questioning God's provision, His goodness, and even His presence. A third sign is a sudden, inexplicable coldness toward prayer and Scripture. Where once the soul longed for communion with God, Now there is only apathy. The word that once nourished now feels dry. Prayer that once lifted the soul now seems empty. The enemy knows that if he can sever a believer from these means of grace, he can weaken him greatly. He whispers lies. God does not hear you. Your prayers do nothing. The word has lost its power, and as these thoughts take root, the believer begins to withdraw. The heart that once burned for Christ grows cold, not because the fire has died, but because the enemy has poured upon it the waters of doubt and distraction. A fourth sign is an overwhelming sense of isolation. Though surrounded by brethren, though walking in the company of the saints, the attacked soul feels utterly alone. The enemy seeks to isolate, for he knows that a lone sheep is more vulnerable than one within the flock. He whispers, "No one understands your struggles. You are too far gone for help. You do not belong among them." These thoughts, once entertained, drive the believer further into solitude, where the attack intensifies. No longer strengthened by the fellowship of the saints, no longer encouraged by the presence of others, the soul is left to battle in silence, often unaware that this very loneliness is the enemy's design. A final sign is the resurgence of past guilt and condemnation. Sins long forgiven suddenly come to mind with renewed force. Though the blood of Christ has washed them away, they return as if they were still fresh, bringing with them a sense of shame that should no longer exist. The enemy accuses, seeking to make the believer forget the power of grace. He dredges up old failures, making them seem as though they still have power, as though they still define the soul. If this attack is not recognized for what it is, the believer may fall into despair, believing himself unworthy, unclean, and beyond redemption. The joy of salvation is stripped away, not because it has been lost, but because the enemy has obscured it. These signs are not to be taken lightly. They are not mere moods, not mere shifts in emotion, but clear indications of a battle being waged against the mind. They are the enemy's weapons, wielded skillfully to weaken faith, to separate the believer from his strength, and to drive him into doubt and despair. Those who recognize these attacks for what they are must not remain passive, for the enemy does not relent. He strikes where he sees vulnerability, pressing upon wounds that have not fully healed, exploiting every opening left unguarded. The mind, once a place of peace, becomes a place of unrest, and unless the attack is met with the weapons of truth, the soul will continue to suffer under its weight. The enemy of souls is not reckless in his assaults. He does not charge blindly into battle, nor does he wage war with crude weapons. He is subtle, calculated, and masterful in his deception. He does not announce his presence with a loud voice, nor does he declare his intentions openly. Instead, he moves in secret, sowing seeds of doubt, confusion, and fear with such quiet precision that many do not recognize his work until it has already taken root. His greatest triumphs are not in sudden and violent attacks, but in slow and steady infiltration, where his lies become so entwined with a person's thoughts that they seem to originate from within. His whispers do not sound foreign. They do not come as the voice of a known adversary, but as the gentle musings of the mind itself. He does not say, "I am your enemy, and I will destroy you." Instead, he says, "You are not strong enough, you will never overcome this, God has abandoned you." He disguises himself as the voice of reason, of logic, of experience. He draws from past failures, from personal weaknesses, from moments of struggle, and weaves them into a narrative that seems undeniable. He does not need to shout. A whisper is enough when the heart is already weary. One of his most effective tactics is to plant thoughts that align with one's own emotions. If a soul is struggling with discouragement, he will not come with blatant blasphemy or obvious heresy. Instead, he will gently reinforce the discouragement, adding layer upon layer until it feels overwhelming. "Why bother praying?" he whispers. Nothing changes. If a believer is facing trials, he will suggest, "Perhaps God is punishing you. Perhaps you have gone too far." He works not by force but by persuasion, shaping a person's inner dialogue until it aligns with his own twisted purposes. He also understands timing. He does not strike when a believer is filled with joy and strength, but waits for moments of weakness. He lurks in the background, watching for fatigue, for sorrow, for frustration. A mind exhausted from battle is an easier target than one standing firm in faith. He capitalizes on weariness, on disappointment, on isolation. When a prayer seems unanswered, he whispers, "See, God does not hear you." When a promise seems delayed, he suggests, "Perhaps it was never meant for you." When sin has been committed, He accuses relentlessly, drowning the soul in shame even when forgiveness has already been granted. Another of his cunning methods is distraction. He does not always need to attack with direct opposition. Sometimes he simply needs to divert attention. If he can fill the mind with earthly concerns, if he can clutter the soul with trivial anxieties, if he can keep the eyes fixed on fleeting things, then he has already succeeded in his aim. He does not need to destroy faith outright if he can make it secondary, buried beneath the noise of daily cares. He will use responsibilities, worries, and even good things to accomplish this purpose. If he can keep the soul so preoccupied that there is no room for prayer, no time for scripture, no hunger for God's presence, then he has already achieved his goal. He also exploits the natural weaknesses of human nature. He knows that the flesh is prone to fear, to pride, to self-pity, to resentment. He will fan the flames of these tendencies, using them to his advantage. He will take a small wound and turn it into a deep offense. He will take a minor failure and turn it into a source of crippling shame. He will take an old fear and magnify it until it feels inescapable. He understands the vulnerabilities of every person, and he tailors his attacks accordingly. The prideful he tempts with flattery. The fearful he crushes with despair. The weary he burdens further until they collapse under the weight. Many fall under his influence without ever realizing they have been deceived. They assume their thoughts are their own, their fears are justified, their doubts are simply part of life. They do not see the enemy's fingerprints upon their minds, for he has worked with such skill that his presence is undetected. He does not always need to introduce new lies. Sometimes he simply needs to amplify what is already there. A single doubt left unchecked, a single fear left to grow, a single wound left unhealed, these are enough for him to build his strongholds. He does not relent, and he does not tire. He watches, he waits, and he presses forward with patience. He does not always seek to destroy in a single blow. Sometimes he is content to weaken gradually, to erode bit by bit, to wear down until resistance is gone. His work is slow, but his aim is certain. He does not want mere distraction or discouragement. He wants full dominion over the mind, to turn thoughts away from God, to rob the soul of peace, to replace faith with fear, and to separate the believer from the source of his strength. When a soldier on the battlefield fails to recognize his enemy, he is in the gravest danger. He may hear the rustling in the shadows, he may sense the unease in his spirit, but if he does not acknowledge that he is under attack, he will not take up his weapons, nor will he fortify his position. Many believers suffer under the weight of relentless struggles, unaware that they are engaged in a battle they have not named. They attribute their weariness to mere circumstances, their doubts to natural concerns, their anxieties to personal weakness, and in doing so, they leave themselves vulnerable to an enemy who thrives in their ignorance. There is great cost in failing to discern the reality of spiritual attack. A mind under siege but unaware of the battle will begin to drift, swayed by every thought and emotion without resistance. Doubts will be entertained as reasonable concerns, fear will be embraced as wisdom, and discouragement will be accepted as an unavoidable state. When a soul no longer fights, it begins to surrender, and the slow descent into spiritual despair is all but inevitable. The adversary has no need to strike with great force when a whisper will suffice. If a believer assumes his struggles are merely part of life and does not recognize the hand of the enemy behind them, he will not seek the help he needs, nor will he guard himself against further attacks. A man who does not see the war will not put on his armor. If he believes his battle is only within himself, he will fight with the strength of the flesh rather than with the weapons of the Spirit. He will attempt to reason his way out of his fears, only to find them growing stronger. He will strive to lift himself out of his discouragement, only to sink deeper. He will try to silence the accusations of the enemy with self-assurance, only to hear them louder than before. Without the recognition of the enemy's work, he fights in vain, wrestling against thoughts that are not his own, attempting to conquer a darkness that does not yield to human effort. The cost of ignorance is heavy. A believer who fails to recognize the enemy's hand will mistake the symptoms of spiritual attack for signs of personal failure. He will see his struggling prayer life and assume he is simply weak. He will feel the weight of discouragement and believe he has failed God. He will sense the distance in his heart and assume that he is unworthy of drawing near again. The enemy does not need to speak openly. He allows these conclusions to form naturally in the heart of the unsuspecting. He does not need to tell a believer he is forsaken, he only needs to make him feel alone long enough that he draws that conclusion himself. Many have abandoned their callings not because they were unfit for them, but because they did not recognize the war waged against their faith. Many have walked away from prayer not because they lacked love for God, but because they were burdened by attacks they mistook for their own shortcomings. Many have drifted from fellowship not because they desired to be alone, but because they were convinced that they no longer belonged. The enemy thrives in these unnoticed battles, delighting in the confusion of those who do not see his hand at work. A soul that fails to recognize spiritual attack will also fail to resist it. A soldier who does not know he is being fired upon will not take cover. A believer who does not understand the nature of his struggles will not take up the shield of faith. He will let the arrows of doubt and despair strike him again and again, accepting them as his own thoughts rather than rejecting them as lies of the enemy. He will not wield the sword of the Spirit, for he does not see a need to fight. He will not call upon the strength of God, for he assumes the battle is his to bear alone. He will not seek the counsel of the brethren, for he believes no one else could understand his struggle. There is no greater vulnerability than blindness in battle. A soldier surrounded by enemies but unaware of their presence is in the most perilous position. He may be strong, he may be well armed, he may even have the means of victory within his grasp, but if he does not know he is under attack, he will not move to defend himself. So it is with those who suffer silently under the weight of spiritual oppression, never recognizing that they are engaged in a war that requires vigilance, discernment, and steadfast faith. The cost of such ignorance is not merely difficulty or discouragement, but the slow erosion of faith, the gradual distancing from truth, and the surrender of ground that was never meant to be lost. The enemy does not fight with honor, nor does he abide by rules of fairness. He does not strike in moments of strength but waits for weakness. He does not announce his attacks but moves in secrecy. He does not wage war in the open field but strikes from the shadows. His aim is not simply to wound but to weaken, to wear down, and to render the soul ineffective. He is patient, and he understands that the surest way to bring ruin is not always through great and sudden destruction, but through a slow and steady erosion of faith. Many who suffer under spiritual attack do not realize that the battle is not only for their minds but for their very purpose. The enemy does not merely seek to trouble the believer, he seeks to make him ineffective. A weakened soul cannot encourage others, a discouraged heart cannot bring hope, and a silent tongue cannot proclaim the truth. If the enemy can make a believer feel useless, he has already won half the battle. He does not need to take away salvation if he can take away the believer's confidence, boldness, and willingness to serve. One of the surest signs that the enemy is at work is the presence of a deep and persistent feeling of worthlessness. It does not matter how many victories a person has experienced in the past, how much evidence there is of God's work in their life. This attack comes with such weight that it seems undeniable. The enemy will whisper, "You have nothing to offer. You are not capable. God cannot use someone like you." These words, repeated often enough, begin to take root, and soon the believer withdraws. The passion once felt for the things of God begins to fade. The voice that once spoke boldly now remains silent. The hands that once served eagerly now hesitate. The enemy's goal is not merely to discourage, but to neutralize. He knows that a believer filled with faith is dangerous to his kingdom. A single word spoken in faith can break chains. A single act of obedience can change lives. A single prayer can move mountains. He cannot allow such things to happen, and so he does not always attack with open force, but with subtlety. He does not need to drive the believer into rebellion, he only needs to make him hesitate, to make him doubt, to make him feel unworthy of being used by God. There is no limit to the ways the enemy will accomplish this. He will use past failures, even those long forgiven, to bring shame. He will magnify present weaknesses, making them seem insurmountable. He will twist the words of others, turning encouragement into criticism, kindness into rejection. He will remind the believer of every mistake, every shortcoming, every reason they should not step forward in faith. He knows that if he can make a person feel useless, they will no longer fight. If he can make them feel disqualified, they will no longer strive. If he can make them doubt their calling, they will no longer walk in it. He also works through comparison. He will draw the believer's eyes to others, making their own efforts seem small in comparison. "Look at them," he whispers. "They are stronger. They are more gifted. They are more faithful. What can you offer?" He takes what was meant to be an encouragement, the sight of God working in others, and turns it into a source of discouragement. Instead of being inspired, the believer feels inadequate. Instead of pressing forward, they begin to retreat. They convince themselves that their work does not matter, that their voice is not needed, that their presence makes no difference. Another tactic of the enemy is to bring overwhelming distractions, filling life with so much noise and busyness that there is no room for the believer to step into their calling. He does not always need to attack with hardship, sometimes he attacks with excess. He fills the schedule with endless demands, keeps the mind occupied with trivial matters, and ensures that the heart is so burdened with daily cares that there is no time left for God's purpose. He knows that an occupied soldier is just as ineffective as a defeated one. If he cannot stop the believer outright, he will simply keep them so preoccupied that they never step into the fullness of their calling. The greatest tragedy of this attack is that many do not even realize they have been drawn into it. They assume their feelings of inadequacy are natural. They believe their distractions are unavoidable. They accept their doubts as truth. They do not see the enemy's hand behind their hesitation, their reluctance, their shrinking back. They do not realize that every moment spent believing they are useless is a victory for the enemy. Every opportunity avoided, every prayer unspoken, every gift left unused is ground given over to the adversary. They do not see that what seems like personal struggle is, in reality, a calculated effort to keep them from being effective in the work of God.